Also, I'll take questions at the end or certainly during our discussion panel. If there's a burning question you want to ask me in the middle of the presentation, just let me know or put it in the chat and I'll see if I can work in an answer to the presentation. At the next slide, please. Thank you. At the 2018 spring OAC meeting, I identified occupations 1 through 3 at Columbus Southerly wastewater treatment plant in southern Franklin County, Ohio, as encompassing most of the woodland period. The chronology was identified with 22 radiocarbon dates from 5 sites on an abandoned terrace and floodplain of the Scioto River. More recently, I've undertaken a temporal hygiene and Bayesian analysis to attempt to refine the chronology of the wastewater treatment plant region, and I've added 64 regional radiocarbon dates from roughly 14 sites to provide for a comparison. Today, I'm going to give you an update on this research. You might ask, what is temporal hygiene and what is a Bayesian analysis? I'm not going to go in depth about those, but I will say 9 years ago, Dr. Nolan presented a temporal hygiene analysis of 4 ancient sites in Ohio and elsewhere, which he defined a 3-variable additive method, focusing on the method of the C14 analysis, the material that was dated, and the year in which the assay, the C14 assay, was run, because some of the early dates have, or most all of them have, high variances, and it's not so valuable today. So I've taken this method and adopted it as my own, but I've decided to make the whole process iterative to explore my data set. And I've also added a 4th variable, which I'm calling feature context, which I'll talk a little bit about. Bayesian analysis derives from Bayesian statistics, which are all the rage right now in social sciences and elsewhere. I'm not going to give a whole lot of definition of this, but just kind of the postcard definition. Whereas traditional inferential statistics are based on ideal distributions like the normal curve or the chi distribution. In the Bayesian statistics, you start with prior knowledge about a particular problem and then collect data and do an intervention or a study, as we would call it in archaeology, and you see how your results compare with what was previously known. So it's not really related to the body of statistical theory most of us were educated in. If you had statistics courses in college or graduate school, but it's something that's been around for a while and it's gaining a lot of traction. In our case, because the Middle Scioto Valley has been previously studied and there have been multiple attempts to develop chronologies, we have the radiocarbon curve and other sorts of data sets. There's actually a substantial body of priors, and I'll be using a method called kernel density estimate to develop this analysis. Next slide, please. Thank you. With that introduction, I'll turn back to the case study. Since the 1990s, CRM archaeologists have in several waves conducted archaeological and have found a great deal of information about this era of prehistory from about 800 BC to 900 AD. So in my 2018 presentation, I talked about 5 sites at Southerly, which are located on a relic terrace and floodplain complex of the Scioto River in southern Franklin County. And there is a number of comparison sites that I'm going to draw from in Delaware, Franklin, and Pickaway County, almost all along the river and nearby uplands. But I am going to mention a couple sites that are further afield that I'm comparing. So the woodland period sites encompass early, middle, and late woodland periods and the very end of the tail of the terminal late Archaic. Next slide. These are the 3, you can see the 5 sites in blue, and the one at the south is in black. Occupation 1 is terminal late archaic, early woodland. Occupation 2 is late early woodland to early middle woodland. And occupation 3 is late middle woodland to early late woodland. Next slide. Those are my, I'm sorry, if you can go back, Kevin, I apologize. Those are some of the early radiocarbon dates, or the radiocarbon dates that ASC collected, and then some of the dates that Weller and Associates collected are also in there. And then there's some other dates that are not on that particular graphic, and the 3 occupations. So, next slide. So the method that Dr. Nolan made is the 3 variable method with sample method and year, and I've put that in this spreadsheet. Now he was studying the Fort Ancient period, which to my mind is better known than at least the Middle Scioto Valley during the Woodland period, and he had a cutoff score in his method of 3. Now in the method, as you recall, if you saw the paper or read the subsequent publications, for example, an annual production like a seed or a nutshell gets a higher score than wood charcoal or an unidentified material. And that's going to be critical in what I'm going to talk about. And then there's various score metrics for the other 2 other variables. So higher is better. So, but I considered my study to be exploratory. So I made my cutoff score 2, and I'll show you, and then I do change it up later. So I'll show you how that works out. Next slide. So the first iteration of the study definitely reduced the temporal spans of occupation 1 through 3. One of the biggest issues with looking at sets of radiocarbon dates is they tend to get over dispersed for statistical reasons that are really unrelated to the phenomena you're trying to date. So you end up with these long spans that go well beyond what, just because they tend to be additive, at least the simple methods. So, but we did eliminate I did eliminate 63% of the radiocarbon assays, 16 of them, and I was left with 7. All the conventional radiocarbon counting dates, but there were some problems with the dates because the data that were left were too sparse. There was only 2 or 3 different for each occupation dates were left, and the probability distribution I'll show you here in a second was too spiky, whereas I had no information that the occupations were periodic, or it just seems that there wasn't enough data left to do a good reconstruction. More troubling that some of the dates did not fit the projectile points temporal spans that particularly for occupation 1, and some of the regional comparison sites. So I decided I needed to relax the cutoff score even further. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is a kernel density estimate you're seeing on the top. The probability increases as you go up. So these curves are showing the regions under the curves are the most likely regions the most likely spans of time that these radiocarbon dates are reflecting. And so that's kind of how you can interpret them. One of the big problems I mentioned was the Kramer points are a stemmed projectile point in the woodland period. And whereas they were found in occupation 1 at 2 different sites, they were completely outside of the range I was indicating. So that's telling me that either there's something wrong with the radiocarbon date. This was from the West Runway site in Kentucky, is the only one I could find. I'm looking for radiocarbon dates for Kramer points if anybody has any or knows of any. So I was thinking, you know, I need to change up the so next slide, the second iteration. Thank you. I relaxed the cutoff score from 2 to 1, and that resulted in 17 of 22 radiocarbon dates being accepted into the analysis. And at that point, I was just rejecting conventional dates with problems of materials. And since this is essentially all CRM-derived studies, the material I was finding, and Kevin mentioned this in his paper of the original temporal hygiene analysis, is people aren't reporting what the material is. Okay, sometimes you don't know what it is, and the analyst couldn't tell you, couldn't identify it, and that's one thing. But in other cases, it doesn't appear that the information was that the sample was submitted to a paleoethnobotanist, so you really don't know at that point, and that's a problem. So you see the entry in yellow where one of the radiocarbon dates that Weller ran was right at the cutoff point, and there are a lot of them, and some of the ones that ASC ran too are clustered between, say, 0 and 2. Next slide. So second iteration covers temporal data much better, covers the diagnostics, and seems to be very consonant with the comparison sites, as I'll show you here in a second. It may overshoot the mark a little bit. It's a conservative model, but it's better constrained than the unmodeled data. In other words, if you just compare the radiocarbon spans, the 2 sigma spans, it's better constrained. So next slide. So this is the second iteration of what my kernel density estimates look like. They're a little less spiky. You can see all the sites I've included in the table and down below with their temporal spans. I've got West Runway and Possum Hollow for occupation 1. I've got straight site Balthasar Home, straight site occupation 3 Balthasar Home, Haven site, DL27 that ASC mitigated. These are all occupation 2 and 3 related sites. Marsh Run, President's Club, span pretty much the whole chronology. Scioto Trails and Water Plant site. Here in a minute, I'll show you the comparison in the end of occupation 3 and how that feathers in there. And then I was trying to get various Merrim Trimble related dates also mostly from the Ohio Valley further south. I do have a couple from the Scioto Valley, but I'm having trouble finding them. Next slide. You see a close-up. So for example, the model that we had when we did the mitigation was that occupation 3 was similar to the straight site. It was a nucleated habitation site, and it fits rather well in that occupation 3 used to be much longer than the straight site's occupation, but now the straight site is the first half of the occupation 3 temporal span. So we did cut some years off occupation 3. There's not a whole lot of dates for the 5th century, just the one that I could find for the site that ASC mitigated in Delaware County. Balthasar Home site is right in the interstices where the transition between occupation 2 and 3 are at. Haven site overlaps them both. And I should say for these sites, comparison sites that I have enough data for, like there's a lot of radiocarbon dates for Haven, and most of them are AMS, and they're really nice dates. I did a KDE analysis on them separately, so I'm not showing you the probability distributions, but I'm showing you the temporal spans. So it's actually shorter than what Weller's mitigation report would say. So I've constrained them a little bit there. But overall, like both of us only have 2 dates, so it's pretty limited. So I didn't do the KDE on that. I just did the combination function. All of these analyses are done in Octal, by the way, which is a free program. Next slide. So then I looked at feature context, and I made that a 4th variable, X. And So if a radiocarbon assay was, because I really wanted to dial into this, if the radiocarbon assay was dating a feature or a diagnostic artifact, I gave it a half a point, like if it was near the cutoff, and then I subtracted a half a point if it wasn't really dating anything in particular. So you can see one of these from 2665. It's just dating assured and some debitage and FCR and a feature. It's not dating any diagnostic. There's other ones. I added the straight site into the analysis because I thought it was so critical. And so there's other dates that, it's dating a Chesser point, or like, for example, one of Weller's dates was dating it's an occupation 1 date, so it's an early Adena date. It's dating a round structure, so that's dating something that you really want to date. So I kept that obviously. And so then that knocked out a couple of the dates. So I thought I had done the best that could be done. And I want to, if I can have the next slide, I want to show you a little bit about the Bayesian analysis. You can see the KDE model up there. And then if you look and see the dark gray on the individual radiocarbon dates, those are the portions of the probability distributions that are being kept, because those are the central tendency areas. And then the light gray portions are the ones that it's eliminating, because those are outlying portions. So it's assuming that you're kind of dating the same phenomenon. I mean, it's a smoothing technique, so it's looking for central tendency. So if you've got an errant date in there, you've got a problem. But as long as it's dating the same occupation, that's why you're trying to focus on these diagnostics. Can I have the next slide? So you're looking at the radiocarbon curve for the occupation 2 dates, and you can see where it's eliminated some of the light colors. It's eliminated some of the spans, and the reason is because of overdispersion for one of the factors, but really the radiocarbon curve is showing the fluctuating levels of C14 in the atmosphere in the past. I'm not going to go into the reasons why that is, but it did, and there are certain areas that are plateaus, which are very problematic for radiocarbon dating. So you can have a perfectly good radiocarbon date, but if it falls on a plateau like this Hallstatt plateau, which is 400 years long, it's going to give you a very long temporal span because it cannot resolve the data any better. The Hallstatt plateau was named after a region in Austria where they were reconstructing in the Neolithic, and they found that this was causing massive problems. It's present in the New World, and there's a few mentions of it in the literature, but a lot of people don't seem to know that much or mention it that much, and I just wanted to point out, if you look at the next slide, a couple of the dates from 2665 from occupation 1, there's no reason that they should be as long as they are. You see the blocky probability structure. The reason is because those dates are running right across that Hallstatt plateau. And so eliminating dates like that from your chronology really helps you to get the bad data out of there. And there's just some periods like the Hallstatt plateau that cannot be reconstructed except with more complex techniques, which we really can't use currently. Can I have the next slide? So this is the 3rd iteration showing the results of all these analyses. Shows substantial improvements in the chronology of 2 of the 3 occupation spans being shorter, but responsibly so. I'm covering the diagnostic data. Also, 2 of the 3 occupation spans are shifted forward a little bit between 60 and 130 years. And I'll talk about why that is and why I think that is in a couple minutes. So can I have the next slide? I've made a non-uniform phase model, which you can do in OxCal, but once you use the KDE analysis, it won't do it itself. You have to sort of draw it out by hand, so I did. And I put the comparison sites there. So it shows that the wastewater treatment plant, I didn't put in occupation 1, because it wasn't as interesting. But occupation 2 and 3, it shows the overlap is about 80 years. And then if you add the straight side in as being new period of nucleated habitations, it adds another 50 or 60 years. And then if you use the water plant site, the 2011 dates that Roy's collected as your termination of occupation 3, it's really clean. In other words, right around 608, 610, it's a really clean phase termination and the beginning of the new phase. But if you were to add Scioto Trails, which is another Newtown phase site nearby, then it goes back and there is some overlap, about 50 years overlap, back to about 540 or 550. And so I discussed that in the paper that I wrote. So in conclusion, I hope I haven't taken up too much time. I'm still supporting notions of temporal succession with some limited overlap of occupations 2 and 3, which is a period of the decline of Hopewell, or the transition period at least. Need to look at the problematic sites and transitions. By combining the temporal and Bayesian analysis in one unified method has some advantages. Using the iterative changes, such as examining feature context to explore temporal reconstructions at various levels of stringency, and to show how the reconstruction changes as different data are admitted or removed from the model, I think is helpful. But you have to kind of watch that you're not kind of gaming it. You can't go into it thinking that you're going to be getting one or another different kind of reconstruction. You're just seeing how it changes and looking for best fit model, one that fits best. The final iteration of the temporal hygiene and Bayesian analysis reduced the temporal span and pushed forward the chronology of 2 of 3 occupations at the wastewater treatment plant. The KDE and Bayesian technique reduced the effect of the radiocarbon plateaus on occupation span. Statistical overdispersion was reduced by the KDE analysis. And finally, what I would say is that it appears that the old wood effect is better controlled by the temporal hygiene analysis. That's what I believe. I can't prove it at the moment, but the fact that the temporal spans were shifted forward suggests that we're getting at the old wood effect and controlling it. But the problem is we can't know that we're doing that, because most of the radiocarbon dates that I eliminated were the ones that were labeled as charred material or had no chemical analysis whatsoever. So I don't really know for certain that it's wood. It could be other things, or there could be other reasons that they were problematic. So the implication for CRM archaeology is that if or any kind of, really anything, is that we should contribute. We can contribute best by using hygienic practices such as good sample and context selection and identifying materials dated. And it's a different thing to say that you tried to identify a radiocarbon dated material and you couldn't identify it, rather than just not even trying and then just submitting it without an analysis. You have to assume that probably most of those dates are wood charcoal dates because it's very common at sites, but we don't know that. So that's my conclusion. I'll be happy to take any questions. I also have a fully written out and illustrated paper, and I can send it to anybody who might be interested. I'm also looking for informal reviewers and to get feedback on the paper if anybody wants to pick that up. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yes.
So we'll open the floor up for a couple of questions, but I just wanted to keep people mindful of the time. It's 11:35. The panel discussion is probably going to be shortened significantly, so we'll take questions for Kevin if anyone has any, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll do our panel discussion up until probably 12:15. That way we're not dipping too far into what we had originally planned for our business meeting. So if everyone's cool with that schedule plan, I open the floor to questions for Kevin Schwarz. Don't everyone speak up all at once now.
reminder, if you're probably muted, so if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself or go ahead and type it into the chat box.
Hey, Kevin Schwarz, this is Jared.
Yes.
Hey, how did you determine what the dated material was? Were you just looking at the laboratory sheets?
I was looking at the reports for dissertation. In your case, as you recall, I sent you an email to ask about one sample.
Yeah.
And in other cases, I looked and I didn't, you know, if somebody writes a CRM report, then 10 years later, you have a question about what material you used, you know, do they remember or do they know? So I thought about contacting people, but I did in your case, obviously that's not a CRM report. But you know, I didn't think that necessarily that was the best way to go because memories fade. And I would just highly encourage people when they write these reports to include a table with all the relevant data, or at least put it in the, you know, so.
So Kevin, what level, this is Bob Dunhammer, what level of specificity, how much did you want to know? Is it good enough to know that it's just charred material? Is it wood charcoal?
Mhm.
Kind of wood? What did you want to know?
Yeah. You know, there's various levels of information, and I have some tables I can send people what I report. I report everything that the paleoethnobotanist tells me. And you know, for example, I remember when Karen Leone was working for Ove, she would tell you what kind of wood you were dealing with, if you were dealing with wood. And then she would tell you what its characteristics are. So if you're going to submit I'm just throwing something out, like basswood versus, okay, so some tree species are really long-lived and others aren't. So, you know, and she would put that information in her reports so that you could select, even when you were dealing with wood charcoal. And I'm not saying it's totally valid to submit a wood charcoal date, but we want to know the maximum amount of information about it. And then in the dates, if you put a table or whatever, include those radiocarbon, all the details like the delta C13 and any other isotopic data that's in there, and what lab ran it, the lab number, because the lab keeps the data too. So if, you know, they don't try to identify the specimen, but just all the data that you can possibly get in that report is helpful, because it's not just me. I'm sure some of you probably have been contacted, but Bob Kelly at University of Wyoming is running a NSF study, and he's reaching out to people all over the Eastern United States to try to develop a better radiocarbon data set for this whole part of the country. So, you know, the more data that one can put into these things, the better.
I would also note that Tony Cruz and Derek Hamilton in American Antiquity, I think 2018, they also talk a lot about good best practices for, I mean, that's the main point of their paper, best practices for Bayesian analysis and how you can get into it if you don't know what it is and how to use OxCal. But I'm pretty sure in that article, they also list the type of things that are recommended, best practices to include when you report dates.
Yes.
And actually, I was just, because I was up really late last night writing reports and looking at SAA style guide, SAA actually has some recommendations that don't go as far as Hamilton and Cruz, but and others that are out there. But most people, even that publish in American Antiquity, don't include that information with their dates. And so even just saying it was a seed, I don't know what it is because I have no money, and it was wood. That right there gives you a little bit of information.
Exactly. Yeah, and also if you calibrate the date, what calibration curve you use, because different calibration curves give different results. It might only vary a little bit, but you know, they get better over time. At least they're trying to make them better.